Okay, had a few technical difficulties, but hopefully this will be our last video for this chapter. So our accessory organs, let's talk about the pancreas. The pancreas is a fairly delicate organ that's tucked up underneath the stomach and is protected by lining associated with the intestines. The pancreas is super important to essentially secreting a variety of things. It is both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland because it is making both what we call pancreatic juices, including that sodium bicarbonate, digestive enzymes. So that's an exocrine that's being released into essentially the small intestine. And then we have this functioning as an endocrine gland. So it's secreting hormones. The two most important hormones it's secreting is insulin and glucagon. So insulin, we know, you've probably heard about it, is going to be super important to regulating our blood sugar, particularly when our blood sugar rises. When we maybe eat a handful of candy and you start feeling kind of jittery or kind of energetic, essentially what's happened is you've flooded glucose into your bloodstream, and let me tell you, insulin's going to know that you did it. So insulin is going to be secreted to essentially lower your blood sugar back to a stable range. Now, sometimes it doesn't work appropriately. So maybe your pancreas, doesn't work at all. So you might have this autoimmune disease called type 1 diabetes. So essentially what happens is that we're not making enough insulin because the body is attacking the insulin cells. This is typically diagnosed in children, but as adults, we can essentially express type 2 diabetes. So it's super important to have your A1C checked as you're getting older to ensure that your cells are still reacting to the insulin. When your cells become insulin resistant, it means that your blood sugar is going to start to creep up and you're not able to regulate your blood sugar like you should. There are some risk factors that we can be aware of, like obesity and not being active enough, physically active. Of course, family history. And one thing that we don't always talk about is the use of alcohol. Alcohol can be high in sugar and so can essentially exacerbate our blood sugar. All right, the liver. So the liver's got tons and tons and tons of jobs. It is detoxifying, it's metabolizing, it's doing all sorts of incredible things. It's has its own liver function. Anyway, it's just got a lot of important roles that it's doing. Of course, managing the fat in our bloodstream is one of those things. There's also this thing called the first pass effect. So when we take medications orally, oftentimes it's going to the liver to be metabolized before it's actually having its effect in our body. So the actual dose that we have to take of a medication is higher than what we really need because the liver is going to try to essentially eliminate that from your body. Then we know that the liver is going to be making the bile. Gallbladder is going to store the bile. You might have had gallstones before. So essentially when we have some hardened stone-like material that's in that liquid of the gallbladder, then we can develop gallstones. But essentially we know that bile is going to help emulsify fat in the small intestine. And here we go, the liver. Things I mentioned, I mentioned this one. Let's take a look at this. Stores vitamins, produces plasma proteins, regulates blood cholesterol, also involved in blood glucose homeostasis. So it can store glucose as glycogen. Glycogen is a complex carbohydrate, and this is your body's way to take the simple sugars that you have absorbed across the small intestine, and when your blood sugar increases, it's going to store some of that for later. Not as glucose, but as glycogen. So we're going to store that in the liver and your muscles. And then we have another hormone called glucagon, also made by the endocrine functions of the pancreas, so we can break down that glycogen and form glucose when our blood sugar is low. You see that the liver is also going to be important to forming urea. So this is going to be a waste product that we're eventually going to take to the kidneys and excrete out of the body. All right, so here's a nice little table that summarizes the last slide. So if we're thinking about the relationship of these organs, so we have the liver that sits underneath our diaphragm, bigger on the right-hand side, smaller on the left-hand side, tucked underneath the left-hand side. We have the pancreas, and then again, the pancreas is making both exocrine elements, if you will, or it has an exocrine function, so it's making that pancreatic juice. Excuse me. And it's also going to be making the hormones, so that's its endocrine functioning. And essentially it's going to be dribbling some of this material into directly into the stomach. Oh, my problems today. All right. The other thing that's happening here, remember the liver is making the bile. The bile is essentially going to be stored in the gallbladder, and then it's going to be dribbling also into the small intestine. Okay, so we move from the small intestine into the large intestine, and essentially then we're going to have the very tail end of the small intestine is called the cecum, and it is where it joins to the large intestine, or what we're going to call the ascending portion of the colon. So the appendix is there. It's a projection off the cecum. We already talked about that a little bit, maybe not. It fights infection. Sometimes like it acts up. And if you have an acute pain in the lower right quadrant, then, they're always going to wonder whether that's appendicitis. So, okay, so now we have the large intestine. The large intestine is going to be essentially specializing in creating solid waste. It's going to absorb the excess water from essentially the small intestine, and then it's going to use things like bacteria called E. coli to make vitamin K, and then we're going to absorb the last little bit of good stuff from this material before we are solidifying and making our feces. So here we go. So the small intestine here, joining the small intestine, the cecum. We have the appendix, we have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and then we have the sigmoid colon, which makes the turn, and then we have the rectum. And so that's where we're going to be accumulating this material, the solid waste, that's going to be the undigestible products of digestion. We see that the large intestine does not have digestive enzymes. It's not necessarily absorbing nutrients except certain vitamins. I mentioned that, the vitamin K. It's very important that we have enough water in our diet so that we don't get constipated. We also know that we have too much water in our large intestine, we can have diarrhea. So that balance is super important. So the vitamins that are produced by the microorganisms in the intestine, so what we call intestinal flora, need material from our essentially feces to produce those particular vitamins. So in addition to vitamin K, we have a number of B complex vitamins. So it's essentially what we will do by the time we are done with making the feces, we will absorb as much water that we're able to, and then it will be stored in the rectum. The act of defecation essentially is a bulk movement of material in the large intestine, and you get this urge, you get this feeling like you need to go to the bathroom. And essentially what's happening is the rectal walls are stretching and nervous impulses are traveling to the spinal cord, and the rectal muscles are going to begin to contract. Our anal sphincters, another sphincter holding things in, and slowly allow things to pass out or pass down the digestive tract, is going to relax, allowing the feces to move. And then, of course, we actually have an internal anal sphincter, external anal sphincter. So the internal one is generally being governed by the nervous system. And the external anal sphincter is skeletal muscle, so you can control it. So if you're not close to a bathroom, you might be like, oh, I got to hold it till whenever you get to the bathroom after work or whatever. So you have control over that external sphincter. So this is the end of the digestive system. We have one more system to cover for Module 4, and that's the endocrine system. So I'll see you again soon.